Welcome to Green and Red, Scrappy Politics for Scrappy People, a regular podcast on radical environmental and anti-capitalist politics, brought to you by Bob Bazanko and Scott Parkin.
Welcome to the silky smooth sounds of the Green and Red podcast. I'm your co-host, Scott Parkin, in Berkeley, California today. Bob is off on assignment, but we'll be back very soon. Today, we're going to be talking about Berkeley, California. We're going to be talking about People's Park, which has a history here in Berkeley, but it also has there's a lot of like current events also going around People's Park that we're going to get into. Joining me today is Mat Wranovix with Left in the Bay. Left in the Bay is an independent research collective working to document the history of people's struggle in the San Francisco Bay Area. Matt, welcome to the Green and Red podcast.
Thank you.
Yep. And so just a little bit of a background for the audience, if you're not aware, about 2 weeks ago, a small army of police secured People's Park, which is a historic park in the neighborhood near the UC Berkeley campus, the cleared of the people who had been living there. There's long established homeless encampments there. They've also established walls of shipping containers that surround the park. A little bit of a background, the University of California actually owns the property. They bought it in the 1950s, where it sat dormant until April 1969, when activists declared it People's Park, and a 50-year struggle began around that. And so we're going to get a little bit into that. But Matt, maybe just like to kick it off, looking at the history of People's Park, it's interesting that the struggle, what's going on there now, is not too dissimilar from what we've seen there over the years, beginning in the late 1960s. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, the struggle around the park has changed a lot over the years and has meant different things to different groups of people that have used the park in different ways. You mentioned the university owns the land. One slight correction is that they didn't actually buy the land in 56 or in the 50s, but in the 1950s announced their intentions to eventually acquire the land via eminent domain purchases, which purchase is like a euphemism in an eminent domain context, because of course they just seize the land and then pay the owners what they deem the land is worth. They didn't actually buy the land until 67. And they bought the land, with the express intention of clearing out the people who lived on it, who were like hippie radicals of various stripes who the university felt were causing problems for themselves and for the students. And so there's a political struggle that ensues in the 60s around controlling that space and what it means to control that space, who owns it, who has a right to own it. Over the years, because it's existed as this kind of like free space outside of the normal property and security order of Berkeley, it's been a place that unhoused people have been able to build a community, build multiple communities in different ways over different time and support each other. And so this fight from the university side to get rid of the park since the late 60s has on the one hand been about controlling the space on that explicitly political terrain, and on the other hand about clearing out this site of undesirables from the university's point of view. In the mid-60s, radical, non-student radicals, and like countercultural types, since really the 80s, unhoused people who the university doesn't feel have a place around the university and its students. Now there's a third dimension to the struggle, which is fighting over the park as a sort of historical site. So there's people who organize around the park as a political statement, which is to say as a statement against the control of private property over land as such. Then there's people who organize around it as a place that unhoused people live and support each other and keep each other safe in various ways. And then there's another group of people that struggles over it as an important historical site that should be protected on those grounds and not demolished to build student housing or anything else. I don't mean to suggest that those are like fully distinct groups of people. They're obviously not. There's a lot of crossover between those groups. But I think that's one way that the fight right now is different from the fight in the late 60s,
Mhm.
where it didn't have those other dimensions.
Yeah, I saw in doing a little bit of research that was officially listed on the National Register of Historic Places just in 2022, which I also have seen that there's been like a number of lawsuits
Mhm.
around that particular element of it as well.
Yeah, that's mostly been led by People's Park Historic District Advocacy Group. They're a group of people that have been working assiduously to defend the park as a historic site, and they managed, I think last year or the year before, as you said, to get it listed on the National Registry of Historic Sites, which I don't think protects it from demolition really in any way, but is maybe a step towards that. And they have a lawsuit ongoing right now that I think is currently before the state Supreme Court about whether or not the UC can build on the property. I really don't know the ins and outs of that case,
Mhm.
so I don't want to go on too much about it because I'm sure I'll say things that are not true or are ill-informed. But as it stands right now, because of that lawsuit and because of an injunction having to do with an environmental assessment on construction on the park site, the university is currently barred by the courts from constructing on the site, from engaging
And
in construction projects.
and just so our audience is clear, what is it they actually want to build there?
Okay, that's a very important question. Yeah.
Yeah.
So what they want to build there are dorms. When the land was first eminent domained in 67 and demolished, the official plan was to construct an intramural athletic playing field on the site.
Mhm.
This is an important point because the idea that they've always wanted to build student housing there and the construction of the park by community members and political organizers was a sort of protest against the planning of or planned construction of dorms is this like very persistent myth that the university has spread itself. And I went trying to get ready for this interview, actually. I was like, how long have they been talking about building dorms on this site? And I dug and dug and dug trying to figure out like when this idea first emerged. And it isn't until right after the park is first built and then destroyed the first time in May
Mhm.
of 69. Then the university builds the playing field that they had always said they were going to build, but with the caveat that eventually now they're going to build dorms there. And they
Mhm.
present it in this way where they're like, this is always what we wanted to do. But if you go back and look at their press releases and news reports from when they actually got the land in 67,
Mhm.
it was clear that dorm construction was going to take place in other properties that they bought in that same sale, mostly on Dana Street. And the lot, which became People's Park, which was most of the 2400 block of Telegraph, with except the Telegraph frontage,
Mhm.
was going to be a playing field. And they even talk about we had a playing field called, I think, Union Field, but we built over it to build Zellerbach Hall, and so we needed soccer field. So that was the initial plan. They demolished the houses that were on that land, left it fallow intentionally, hoping to drive people out of the neighborhood. That's another story I'm sure we'll get to later.
Mhm.
Since 69, after the park was built by people in the neighborhood, the university cleared them out. They built a playing field there. Then in 72, the people reclaimed the park, so to speak. They took the fences down from the playing field. They started planting what have you, trees, built gardens, and then it was a park ever since. But that whole stretch of time since 69, the university has been saying, we are eventually going to build student dorms here.
Mhm.
And they were saying that back then when we didn't have the housing crisis that we have now in the Bay
Mhm.
Area,
Mhm.
when they couldn't even fill the dorms that they had on campus. There was
Mhm.
no urgent need to construct dorm housing. They had too much of it. People didn't want to live in it. It was Berkeley in the 60s. It was like it was cheap and it was a
Yeah.
ton of fun. Students did not want to stay in these dorms. So there was no need for them at the time. But I think that the idea of building dorms there emerges because it does two things for the university. One is it obviously, if you build student housing on the site, it's impossible to turn it into a park again. Whereas if you leave it as an intramural playing field, the risk is always there that somebody's going to come, rip the fences down, turn it into a public park.
Right.
The other thing is that in terms of public support for the project or for the university in this conflict, saying you're going to build student housing is like it's a lot easier to get public support for that versus public support for saying we're going to build a soccer field here that's only for university purposes, even though it was a public park and people liked it as a public park. That's not as good a sell. So the switch happens then. So ever since then, they've been saying we're going to build it into dorms eventually. There's a lot of things that happen in between then and now, but now they've emerged with this new plan that they've been pushing for the past few years. They are very clear this is their final plan, this is what they're going to do. And the idea is demolish the park, which they've effectively done now, and build on it one high-rise dorm complex, which is going to house about 1,100 undergraduates. Then, in response to various public pressures and outrages over this situation for a long time, they added two other pieces to that plan. One of them is a supportive living facility for currently unhoused people that's supposed to house about 100 people with services, programs, beds, that sort of thing. That's supposed to be on the same little block lot as the dorm building. And then turn the rest of it, which is about half of the remaining park space. And keep in mind, this is a small, the park itself is less than a single city block. It's like 2.8 acres or something. And then the rest of it will be left as a green space, which will commemorate
like
the history.
Narrow strip green space.
Yeah, there's really, at that point, it's like a walkway. And it's supposed to commemorate the history of the park in some way. I don't know if you've seen the mock-ups that they put out on their Instagram account. They're stunning as far as tastefulness goes. The way that they've proposed to like honor the history of the park is in the graphics, which are these like mock-ups that they put up online. Students walking in this sort of green strip walkway, and the walls above them are like reproductions of historical newspapers about People's Park. And the one that they show the kid looking at in the digital mock-up says, "Bulldozer gouges away happy dream."
I've actually been up there. I know what you're talking about. I know exactly where that wall of news strips is.
Oh yeah. It's amazing.
You see, we've actually done a couple, like on this show, we can be very hypercritical of not just the right, but also of liberals, and neoliberalism in the academy is a real thing. There's this touches on this particular struggle touches on a number of issues, one of which is neoliberalism, the university, the state doing away with common spaces, public spaces. And this isn't even a city park. This is like a people's park that has been reclaimed by the people. And here we have this neoliberal entity, which is the University of California. And we've documented the struggle of neoliberalism in the University of California in a couple of episodes when we've talked about some of the different strikes in Santa Cruz and in 2022 all through the UC system. But what is there's where they want to build housing and basically claim this space. But what are some other goals here? Do they want to do away with even just this tiny pocket of resistance, or is it around to where they're turning students into consumers and basically a money-making apparatus? I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that around the neoliberal implications of what's going on with People's Park.
Yeah, that's a great and very big question that I feel.
Yeah, we go for the big questions on Green and Red podcast.
Yeah, as you should. Just to start, just talking about the park specifically, I think that one needs to look at the university's struggle to construct on People's Park a little bit differently and in a slightly different context than the university's massive construction projects elsewhere, because this is like an old grudge for the UC. I think that they've never given up on, and it is an end in itself. To destroy the park is an end in itself and has been for a very long time. I think that if you look at the history of the block where People's Park is, you can see the project of remaking that area that the university has been engaged in for a long time, and it's an incredible success, right? The 2400 block of Telegraph, Moe's Books is over there. There's Amoeba Record, but it used to be a center for a community that was not merely students. There was Cafe Mediterranean right in the center of the block that was like a real gathering space and a social space for people who were outside of this kind of student consumer nexus. And now the park is like the only remaining element of that Berkeley. And I think that it's the destruction of it is emblematic of that project,
Mhm.
right? To remake the South Campus area into a kind of like shopping mall for students.
Yeah.
And the removal of a homeless population from the sight line of those students is part of like selling a sort of consumer package to middle class and wealthier students, a consumer package geared towards a certain kind of student life experience, right? And that's part of this whole project of remaking the area.
And what is so this gentrification? It's
Yeah,
gentrification. This
absolutely.
gentrification project that's been going on over in that what's going on? It's going on all over the Bay Area. It's going all over the world. What has resistance looked like in just? We're going to get a little bit into the resistance in the late 60s, but what has
Yeah.
some of the more recent resistance looked like in the last few years to new moves
Mhm.
by the university to clear the park and do everything that they're in motion of doing now?
Yeah. Gentrification has obviously been like a key political issue in the Bay Area for a very long time now, many decades, one of the key political issues. And so there's obviously a lot of different ways that resistance to gentrification has looked around the Bay. The park is an interesting thing in that kind of constellation of struggles because the park itself is a tactic of struggle against what we now call gentrification. And so, what the people in the 60s were talking about when they claimed the park is they were saying the university is using these urban renewal tactics to drive unwanted populations out of this area and remake it for a different group of people, right? And remove organized communities that are organized on different lines in order to do this other thing and organize the space differently to meet the needs of capital. And the park was explicitly a tactic to strike back against that, to strike back against what they called move on fascism, meaning get the hell out of here. This area is going to be for somebody else now. And so claiming taking the space up in that specific way, saying like this space will not be allowed to be made into something that serves the needs of capital. It's going to be removed from that kind of operation entirely, is what the park is. And so resistance to gentrification regarding People's Park, I think has looked like, it's looked like a lot of different things, but mainly what it looks like is using the park. So when people have tried to defend the park in the past, they try to get people into the park, right? They build gardens. There was an incredible garden until very recently in the park of native California plants. There were kitchens. There were music festivals held there semi-regularly. There were all kinds of things going on in the park.
Mhm.
And I think sometimes movements against gentrification get caught up in these kind of like repetitive modes of like protests, the old litany of left wing
Yeah.
practices that we're all familiar with. More interestingly, maybe like blocking logistical nodes of various kinds, like the struggles that happened in San Francisco, where people would block the Google buses that were like taking tech workers, wealthy tech workers from San Francisco down to their offices in Silicon Valley. But I think it's important to think about and remember that the park is already like a tactic
Mhm.
in that struggle. It's not
Right.
just a park. It's like a stone lobbed in the direction of this process that now we call gentrification,
Right. A great
which is one of
metaphor.
the reasons that one of the key reasons I think that the university wants to get rid of it is it serves as this site that like whatever else, however else successful they are at remaking the South Campus area or Southside Berkeley, there's this space that can always be a gathering space and can always be like a space to regenerate certain kinds of activity that's contrary to the wishes of the UC. I want to jump back to your last question really quick, because I did something that I feel a lot of people do when they talk about the park, and I don't like it. And I just did it myself, which is speak about the park almost as though it's the 60s happened and that was one moment, and now there's the present day, when of course there's been the whole wave of struggles over the park. There's been 6-7 waves of riots over the years over it, and we should be clear that in the late 80s and early 90s, rioting was an intentional and important part of the struggle over the park and against gentrification in Berkeley. There were these huge, particularly in 89, but then again in the early 90s, when the university tried to carve up the park in different ways, where people would gather and then they would go out and they would smash all these Southside businesses. That's been a tactic too. And I don't want to jump over that historically in a way that I think often gets done.
Maybe we can talk a little bit about the origins of People's Park, where it became People's Park. Maybe talk a little bit about how it happened, how it became this stone, which we were lobbying at the gentrification of that part of Berkeley and other parts of Berkeley, who was part of that movement, and how it proceeded, particularly thinking about what was happening there in the late 60s into the 70s. There's a lot around that 60s, 70s moment, and a lot of people who are involved in it still today were part of that effort back then as well.
Yeah, definitely. Before I hopped on this interview, was trying to run over in my mind like how to tell the story of the foundation of the park. And there's this thing when you talk about history, I'm sure you've experienced, where we could talk about this, we have to talk about that, and if we talk about this, we have to talk about that. And before long, I realized to tell the story of People's Park, you got to go back at least to 1934, but we probably don't really have the space to do that here, unfortunately. But what I will say is, to understand the formation and foundation of People's Park, you need to understand the conflict over the category of non-student or of street person that emerges in the mid to late 60s in Berkeley. And to understand that, you need to understand this whole history of the way that non-students participated in student political life in a way that emerges from the political culture, the sort of left progressive political culture of the Bay Area, that I think is specific to the Bay Area, which is why I wanted to go back to 1934, just to say that.
Please start at 1934 if you.
Let's start at 1934. So in the 30s and 40s, the Communist Party is like the hegemonic force on the American left, right? They were always a little different in California. They were always the California sort of branch. There wasn't a formal branch, but the California groupings of the party were always a little more intellectually independent, a little more given towards coalition building, a little bit less ready to toe the Soviet line in all times and on all issues, certainly far less dogmatic on a lot of things. The 1934 general strike on the San Francisco waterfront, which spreads throughout the Bay Area, creates a kind of set of institutions in the Bay Area that become a part of Bay Area public political life. I'm thinking mainly of the Longshore Union, which becomes the ILWU eventually. In these institutions, another one is the California Labor School, which becomes a big school in the Bay Area, an art department as large as SFAI's, I think, for a time. The Communist Party participates and sort of plays leading roles in these institutions, but doesn't dominate them precisely. And the Communist Party and other sort of radical left groupings are able to play a part in Bay Area political life through the beginning part of the Cold War, through the end of World War II, into the 50s, in a way that like really doesn't exist in a lot of parts of the country. The roots they set down are deeper, and the winds that batter them, I think, are less strongly elsewhere. So they come out of the Red Scare, out of McCarthy, severely weakened, but with this kind of like rich social infrastructure, left-wing infrastructure across San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, that has roots in the working class Black communities. It has roots in like intellectual communities and academic communities in Berkeley. It has roots on the San Francisco waterfront. So there's this left culture, the coalitional, ecumenical, that already exists in the Bay Area in the early 60s.
Mhm.
So when the civil rights movement kicks off in locally, like the kind of post-50s direct action oriented civil rights movement, like inspired by SNCC and CORE in the South, it's the children of Communist Party members that like play the leading role in setting up these like local organizations that do that kind of work, these like direct action sit-ins directed at
The red
racist
diaper
hiring.
baby, red diaper babies.
Yeah, exactly. They play a huge role. Young communists, like children of communists, found a group called the W.B. Du Bois Club, which in turn helps found a group called the Ad Hoc Committee to End Discrimination, which kind of plays the leading role in these. In 1963, we're talking right now, putting together these huge illegal direct action civil disobedience sit-ins at Bay Area businesses that have racist hiring practices.
Mhm.
After a couple early successes, and these are like very combative projects. After a few early successes, they decided to target the Oakland Tribune, which is like the center of power in the East Bay. To do that, they go to UC Berkeley. They go to Sproul Plaza, where they basically recruit students to like, and the Bay Area, it's basically a straight shot from UC Berkeley into downtown Berkeley. You just go down Telegraph.
Yeah.
So they go up there, recruit students. They aren't all students doing this. A lot of them aren't, but they recruit these students, get them to go downtown Oakland and sit in at the Tribune building to protest its racist hiring practices. And this goes and escalates and escalates. And this combined with like other sort of civil rights direct action projects that are going on at the time that involve a lot of kids who are at Berkeley causes local business pressure to come down hard on the UC administration, who are like liberal administration, sees themselves as like forward thinking. And they basically say, look, these non-student rabble-rousers are going into your campus and they're getting your students to come cause trouble for us. We need to put a stop to this. And so to put the kibosh on it, they come up with all these onerous rules around political speech on campus.
Yeah.
Which is then what leads to the free speech movement, right? This explosion of activity around that. It's really a response to like business pressure coming down on the university to crack down on civil rights activity. And a crucial lesson that comes out of that moment for the student activists themselves, for these like young student organizers and activists, is one that like that the powers that be want to divide them from this like non-student population of so-called outside agitators, and that's a bad thing. And two, they learn that even though most of these are like white middle class kids who are like highly privileged in early 1960s America,
Yeah.
they realize that if they want to act in solidarity with oppressed people, whether they're Black people in their own cities or soon Vietnamese people abroad, they learn that their own activity is going to be restrained. That despite their privilege, they're not free to act in a way that conforms to their own conscience and their own beliefs. And so the ideas very quickly mutate from being just about civil rights solidarity and free speech and stuff like that to being about autonomy. And these ideas about we have a right to dictate the conditions of our own lives and to have a say in how the university is run, and have a say in how our neighborhoods are run and how our cities are run.
And how the Students for Democratic Society had put the Port Huron statement out, I think in 62.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Just a couple of years before the free speech movement kicks off in 64. Do you know how influenced they were by SDS's Port Huron statement?
That's a really good question that I wish I had a better answer to. I think the answer, frankly, is not that much. I think because Tom Hayden, who's like the principal author or one of the principal authors of the Port Huron statement, who ends up becoming a major player in People's Park, although he's not remembered that way. He came to Berkeley, if I'm not mistaken, and spent some time there prior to writing the Port Huron statement. And these ideas are already percolating in Berkeley in a big way. And one of the major drivers of them is Hal Draper, who's this Marxist intellectual from New York, who's a librarian at UC Berkeley, who has his own group that's this kind of Trotskyist formation called the Independent Socialist Club. That guys like Mario Savio, who's famous free speech movement guy, Jack Weinberg, are members of the ISC. And I think that influence, I think that there was some cross current there. But I think, and this maybe is just because I'm a Bay Area chauvinist and I always want to tell a story that like starts there, but I think it's true. I think that the currents that are coming out of Berkeley are doing a little more to influence the direction of SDS than the other way around.
Right.
Particularly because SDS really doesn't have a presence in Berkeley during this period. And throughout the 60s, they never become a dominant force in campus political life in the Bay Area. There's always, and people who are, I listened to an interview with an old SDS guy recently, not about Berkeley stuff, and I can't even remember his name, which is embarrassing. But he's talking about, people talk about the student movement in the 60s. Really, that was just SDS in 99% of places, except the Bay Area, where SDS barely had a presence, and there were all these other, there was this kind of like coalitional model that prevailed in the Bay Area.
That had been around since the 30s.
Yeah, that kind of grew out of that. Yeah. So like the free speech movement isn't really an organization, right? It's like there's all these different organizations. Like there's the Young Socialists, there's the Independent Socialist Club, there's the Communist Party kids, there's the civil rights groupings, blah, blah, blah. There's all this stuff. And they come together and they make the free speech movement. And then when the free speech movement ends, they move in, that moves into the anti-war movement, and the same model gets followed, where there's all these little groupings that come together on an ad hoc basis around a specific issue. And it creates this, sorry, go ahead.
Go on.
Oh yeah, it's just, it creates a kind of a durability and also a community of struggle around not just one issue, but around a whole way of being political. If that makes sense.
I've been living and organizing in the Bay Area for close to 20 years, and I would say that model is what is in existence. Even within the last 6 months, I did a lot of organizing around the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation. It was very much rooted in that sort of coalition politic, where we had everything from anarchists to Maoists to the Filipino community to mainstream labor to climate groups, all with very different ideologies, but were rooted together in a coalition where we were against this terrible thing that was called APEC. A lot of the Gaza stuff I'm seeing right now is also very much rooted in similar things. Everything from old anti-nuke activists who are blocking Travis to Arab and Muslim folks out marching in the streets, raising hell every day.
Totally, yeah. It's never gone away, really.
As
a way of doing things. And that poses a real threat to institutions of power, because there's not just one thing that you cut off and crush to kill the movement, which is why the focus then becomes, in the mid 60s, around 65, 66, the focus becomes on this neighborhood, the South Campus neighborhood, the Southside neighborhood, which is where all these, the same way that all these people from all over the country came to the Haight-Ashbury in the 60s to participate in these new kinds of lifestyle experiments, the same thing's happening in Southside Berkeley, but with it attracts a kind of like more militant political edge, but largely the same kind of stuff, like experiments with communal living and drugs and sex and music and art and all this stuff. And a lot of the people who become leaders of these ad hoc campus political formations are non-students who live in this neighborhood, which does not respect the boundaries between student and non-student at all. They cross it freely all the time. And so pressure comes down from, obviously, from the campus itself, from the administration itself, but from the state government. This guy, Don Mulford, who's I forget he's a state representative, whatever. He's a Republican in the state legislature. The same guy who famously, a couple of years later, or maybe just 1 year later, introduces the bill to disarm the Black Panthers. That leads to the big armed show in Sacramento. And Ronald Reagan, who's just been elected governor in 66.
And part of what Reagan wants to do is crack down on radicals, both student radicals and radicals, like the Berkeley free speech movement and the Black Panthers and things like that became prime targets for him.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's politically important for them to shut down this movement. And what they say totally outright in print in the state legislature, they say, look, you have all these bad seeds living in this neighborhood. You have these like runaways, communists, beatniks, just bad people that you don't want mixing with our students, and they're stirring them up and causing all this trouble. And the reason they're all living in this neighborhood isn't just because it's close to the university and that leads to a certain kind of synergy. That's true. They're also living there because it's cheap. It's so cheap to live in Southside during this period. The reason for that largely is because, as you mentioned earlier in this interview, in the 1950s, or we mentioned together, in the 50s, the university announces a plan to expand into Southside. And they announce that they're going to eminent domain at some point in the future. They plan to expand by declaring eminent domain on all these buildings in the Southside neighborhood, demolishing them and taking them over. And so the people who own those houses, they don't maintain them. They don't jack up the rent, really. They just leave them there as these cheap buildings that they're like, these are all going to get taken by the state in a couple of years anyway, so fuck it. And because of that, it becomes like a prime place for these kids who are moving in from all over the country, most of whom have no money, to move in. And it becomes this neighborhood that people in charge feel poses a great threat to them. At the urging of people in the state legislature and other people in positions of power locally, the university decides to move in 66 on this old plan from the 50s and begin demolishing the Southside neighborhood, basically, to drive these people out. And they're very upfront that this is what they plan to do. The police massively step up harassment of people in the area. They basically are directed to harass anybody with long hair who looks like a hippie. Because of that, they find a bunch of drugs on people. They search a bunch of people, find drugs on them. Drug arrests skyrocket. The police look for crimes. They find them. The crime statistics shoot up. It gets designated a high crime area. And the university's, look, we're going to do urban renewal here. This is the same period that like urban renewal projects are kicking off all over the country. And like in the Bay Area, you have urban renewal projects in like Western Addition, where they're forcing Black people out. You have urban renewal south of Market to force poor people out. You have urban renewal in Berkeley, in West Berkeley, over at Oceanside to force Black people out.
Manila Town,
Exactly.
in the near the financial district.
Exactly.
Between Chinatown and the financial district is completely forced out. The Filipino community there is totally forced out.
So this is happening all over the place, and this instance of it is unique, as far as I know, in that they're trying to force out a majority white community with middle class roots. Most of these kids are from like middle class backgrounds, but they're considered a sort of undesirable population, and so they use the same tool set of urban renewal to force them out of the South Side. And they start buying up all these properties and raising them left and right. And resistance pops up almost immediately. Where the Dwight Triangle now, I know this might be a little Berkeley centric for people who don't live there, but across the street from People's Park, or the block where People's Park is, there's the Dwight Triangle.
Dwight Avenue is one of the streets that run kind of parallel, that the park is on.
Yeah, exactly. That building there on that corner had been where Jerry Rubin lived, who was the head of the Vietnam Day Committee, who goes on to found the Yippies.
He's one of the Chicago Seven. He's one of the Chicago Seven as well.
Exactly. And in that, there's all these complaints in the local press by people who just live in this neighborhood who are not like hippie radical types at all, and by obviously the radical types. They realize that there's like a war on them. At one point, I found one article about some kids plant dynamite in one of the bulldozers and blow it up. So there's various kinds of resistance that go on. And an early one is that the founders of this group called Ecology Action, which is one of the earliest kind of left ecological formations that now I think is just a nonprofit, as many of these groups end up. They come up with the idea to plant on the site of the building that Jerry Rubin used to live in. They plant a sort of like guerrilla garden, and they call it C.P. Herrick Peace and Freedom Park. It doesn't last very long. It's only there for a couple days. But this emerges early as an idea of, we're going to reclaim the space by turning it into something beautiful. And we're going to prevent them from driving us out from being able to build the new buildings they want to drive us out by making a garden on the space where we used to live.
Mhm.
So the block where People's Park ends up is one of these notorious blocks it's often described in the local press at the time, like the local sort of like right-wing press, as like the center of Hippieville, the 2400 block of Telegraph. There's big riots in 1968 where the rioters claim that block as their territory. So it already has that meaning locally as a site of contest between the powers that be and between this community of radical students and non-students.
Yeah.
The university eminent domains everything on that block except for the stores at the sort of shops that line the front of it. And they demolish all the houses. Bob Scheer, who is the editor of Ramparts magazine, which is a big local sort of left-wing magazine, he's actually one of the people who lives in that block. Some other notables that I can't remember off the top of my head lived there too. So they demolish the houses, drive all the people out. As we mentioned earlier, officially they're going to turn it into a playing field, a soccer field.
Mhm.
But they don't do it. And they don't do it intentionally because they want it to be a dirty, fallow, disused dirt lot. It's better for their purposes for the neighborhood to be hideous
Yeah.
and hostile so that people will leave than for it to be something like useful. So they leave it there for well over a year. It's there for a year and a half. There's no money. They barely get the money to demolish, to buy and then demolish these buildings in the first place. They do not have money set aside to construct new things on most of them.
Right.
So it just sits there. And after a year and a half, the idea comes up in a grouping of people from various sort of left backgrounds, centered around a guy named Michael Delacour, who recently died, who owns a dress shop on that block that didn't get demolished, called the Red Square, which is like where Bongo Burger is now. They decide, let's turn this into a park. And it represents this moment of a coming together of these currents that were never fully separate, the kind of like radical left-wing political current and the kind of hippie so-called counterculture current.
Mm-hmm.
Like they were never fully distinct things ever, but there was always a kind of conflict between these two ways of participating, being the sort of the cultural radicals and the political radicals. And the
Mm-hmm.
park offers an opportunity for them to participate in something together, because what it offers the hippie types is a beautiful space
Mm-hmm.
to build something collectively and enjoy it. And what it offers the political radicals who've been through, at this point, like many cycles of activity, repression, activity, repression, activity, repression, who are looking for a new fight, basically.
Mm-hmm.
It offers them something that they know will become a fight, because
Mm-hmm.
they know the university owns this land. They know that the university demolished these houses so that people like them wouldn't be there anymore. So they know that if they take it over, the university is going to throw them out. They're never going to accept it.
Mm-hmm.
And so they know that will potentially spiral into something that they can lead in a more radical direction. And it's worth noting that this is the spring of '69 when
Mm-hmm.
this happens. The university has already gone through multiple waves of riots, not just in the past 2 years, but has gone through a National Guard occupation already, which kind of gets forgotten about sometimes. In the fall of '69, when the students of color at San Francisco State start the Third World Liberation Front student strike,
Right.
demanding ethnic studies, and crucially, a forgotten element, student control over ethnic studies programs. Not just programs, but like programs that students will run themselves, which they don't get. They do get the ethnic studies. Sister strike kicks off in Berkeley demanding the same things. And it gets really heavy and really violent. The police crack down super hard and the National Guard gets called out. So you'll often see pictures from the Third World Liberation Front student strike at Berkeley incorrectly listed as like People's Park or whatever. It's very hard, unless you're like a super nerd about the specifics of this stuff, to have any sense of what you're seeing if you see a picture of Berkeley in the late '60s, because there were so many of these conflicts. And so anyway, so that's what they do. And it's also, there's another element to it that I think doesn't get the attention it deserves, which is the influence of the Black Panther Party.
Mhm.
Stu Albert, who was one of the founders of the Yippies, along with Jerry Rubin, who's a Berkeley guy, he's very close to Eldridge Cleaver from the Black Panther Party.
Mhm.
And Eldridge Cleaver tells him in early 69 or late 68 that the Berkeley movement needs to, in his words, develop a territorial imperative. So they need to claim space and control it. And so part of People's Park is like operating on the direct advice of the Black Panther Party, which I think is an element that not a lot of people necessarily know.
Right.
That it was an attempt by these white student radicals, or white, not all students, but white radicals, to follow the lead, the strategic lead of Black radicals, Black militants. And another element of it is, as we mentioned earlier, talking about the free speech movement, how there's this move from solidarity actions to thinking about one's own self as being in some way oppressed or controlled and fighting for one's own autonomy, whether or not they're in a privileged position in the social order. The park is not a solidarity action. It's not an anti-war action. It's not a civil rights action. It's not in solidarity exactly with the grape strikers in Southern California. It's for the community that's doing the action itself. And so for that reason, it's seen by many at the time as a major step forward strategically, which I think is also a forgotten dimension of it, that it's embraced by different parts of the left as moving the movement forward.
One thing I wanted to ask about, because we're also getting towards the end of our time, is in May 1969, there's a street riot called Bloody Thursday, where someone was killed. We talk a lot about the students who were killed at Kent State in 1970, but this is
Right.
someone who's killed during, apparently he was a bystander, but he was killed during a protest around People's Park in May 1969. I wonder if you could just touch on that for a moment.
Yeah, totally. Like I said, they found this park in April 69. It's a smashing success that outpaces their wildest dreams. People from every conceivable community come out to build it. It inspires a wave of Black people in South Berkeley building their own parks. It becomes this huge success. It blows way out of what they expected. So when the university inevitably cracks down on it, which they do on May 15th, Thursday, May 15th, 1969, they put a fence up, they destroy what's in the park. The cops put up a sign that says Fort Defiance over where it used to say People's Park. There's a huge rally that gathers on the Berkeley campus. And in the course of a speech, the ASUC president-elect, Dan Siegel, who ran for mayor of Oakland a few years back, you may recall.
When he
says,
had like a KPFA board member or something as well too.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All that kind of stuff. He says, let's go and take the park in the middle of a speech. He claims he didn't mean to say, let's go do it right now. They end up charging him with incitement of a riot for it. But after he says that, this whole crowd of students marches the couple blocks from the plaza to the park, like ululating in imitation of the fighters in the Battle of Algiers. And they run down to rip the fences down. You know, Alameda County Sheriff's deputies are all over the place, and they've been authorized that day to use live ammunition. So their shotguns are loaded up with birdshot and some of them buckshot, and they shoot. They go crazy. It's a police riot basically. They shoot back at the crowd. Tear gas gets thrown back and forth. Cop cars get smashed and burned. It's total chaos. You can see footage of it online. A famous image gets printed on the cover of newspapers where a cop just shoots a Berkeley student as he runs away from him in the back. And I think 100, I don't have the number in front of me, but like 150 people are wounded. This one guy, Alan Blanchard, who is sitting on the roof of the Berkeley Repertory Theater, is blinded. And James Rector, who was a non-student who was visiting campus, is shot on the roof of Grandma Books, which is the Socialist Workers' Party bookstore, named after the boat that that Fidel Castro and his compatriots rode to Cuba. James Rector is shot and a few days later succumbs to his wounds and dies. Which obviously, and then later that day, Ronald Reagan, who was the governor at the time, calls out the National Guard, and Berkeley is then under National Guard occupation for several weeks. After huge confrontations, there's a big peaceful mass march down to the park on Memorial Day. The fences don't come down. That's the end of it. The university builds a playing field on the land. It's fenced in. The rest of it they turn into a parking lot. And by consent of all the different student groups, the student government, the interfraternity council, everyone agrees no one uses this field or this parking lot. And so they just sit there for like years. They just sit there like almost completely unused. If you parked your car in that lot, people would come and slash your tires and shit like that. There's a sign that says parking reserved for James Rector, and it just sits there. The story would have ended there, probably. Actually, it would have just become part of the background of Berkeley, that there's this playing field here. People would have forgotten, and it would have been like an interesting historical note. But then in 72, there's widespread rioting all over Berkeley after news breaks of the Nixon administration's mining of the harbors in Southeast Asia.
Haiphong Bay.
Exactly. Huge riots break out all over the place. And in the sort of chaos, a group of lefties are like, why don't we rip those fences down and take that park back from 3 years ago? And they do. And the next day, hundreds show up to rebuild it.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just been there ever since, until the summer of 2020. The university came and fenced it off, demolished everything in there. Students came later I think that day or the next day, ripped the fences down, reestablished the park, but in a pretty severely damaged state that it stayed in for a year and change, until a couple weeks ago when they moved in under cover of night and put up this double-decker shipping container fence that now there's razor wire on top of, looking exactly like
Doug Ducey, former Governor Doug Ducey's border wall in Arizona.
It looks identical. It's the same. Yeah, it's the double shipping container with the razor wire.
Just to note the comparison of the right-wing Republicans' border wall versus the liberal University of California's wall around People's Park. I like those sorts of things.
Yeah, it's an incredible image. Yeah. But I guess as it stands now, everything's up in the air, and yeah, no one really knows what's going to happen. There's a court case still in progress to determine whether the university is allowed to build there. It seems likely, based on past struggles, that all it takes for the university's plans to be thwarted is for a handful of people to show up and rebuild the park at some moment. Mm-hmm. Which, unless they have 24-hour surveillance, which right now I think they do, which costs just an insane amount of money, it seems inevitable to me at some point, but I guess we don't know. As far as I know, no company is contracted to build the student housing, and if they do win the court case. There was one, but they pulled out because of the hassle. So it's all a great big mystery, but it does seem like it'll be a lot harder to dislodge the park than the UC thinks.
Yeah. I hope to have more shows on this in the future about the sort of future of what happens because I suspect the struggle will pick up again at some point. Maybe just to shift a little bit, just because we're at the end of time. I left with this sort of great portrait in which you just painted of Bay Area political life, which I think was a really great background and context for talking about People's Park. I'd like to hear a little bit about what Left in the Bay is doing. I follow you on Twitter and Instagram, but I think it's an interesting project, and it's definitely everything you've already talked about speaks to the project. But I'm wondering if you could just talk about that for just a couple of minutes about tell us about Left in the Bay.
Sure. Thank you. Basically, we are mainly a couple people. My comrade and friend who should be here with me tonight is unfortunately very sick, and so you're not seeing him. But it's mainly me and one other person that do it. We're both from the Bay Area. Neither of us live there at the moment. And we both feel that there's an extremely rich, there is an extremely rich history of different kinds of what you could call people's movements in the Bay Area that are significant on a kind of like world historical level, but that are not well known outside of a few kind of broad stroke cliches, even
Like People's Park.
locally. Yeah, exactly. And like People's Park gets reduced to, I think there's so many dimensions of People's Park that are like incredibly important. One we didn't even touch on is like the Berkeley Tenants Union comes out of People's Park. Rent control in Berkeley comes out of People's Park. The progressive coalition that goes on to become the ruling party of Berkeley in some ways comes out of the People's Park movement. And you could say the same thing. The Panthers are another huge one. The most significant left-wing group to ever come out of the Bay Area. They get reduced to a kind of caricature, whether by people who don't like them or by people who do like them. And we want to find those stories, find those histories, flesh them back out, make them real stories about real people again, and give them back to people in the Bay Area and elsewhere to better understand where they are and better understand the terrain that they're like living and working and struggling on, how they got to where they are, and the kind of like battlegrounds that they live on. Part of the reason for doing it is ruling forces in the Bay Area don't deal with this history just by denying that it exists, which is what happens in a lot of places. There's a lot of parts of the country you could go to that had, say, massive IWW presence or something like that, and there's just nothing acknowledging it anywhere. Nobody knows anything about it.
Right.
The Bay Area doesn't do that. The Bay Area, because it's governed in this kind of like nominally progressive way, it tries to use and co-opt that history in all kinds of ways that we think are extremely dishonest. And talking about the People's Park thing, for example, like part of the thing that the UC plans to build on the graveyard of the park is this like historical commemoration to the park. If you walk down that, just to keep it all situated there, I mean, we could talk about this kind of stuff all over the Bay, but if you walk down Telegraph Avenue, the little neighborhood street flags that they have hanging up there, they say different, and then the T is like askew. Right. It's got like a tie-dye thing. And so there's this way that this history is mobilized to give some sort of credibility or frisson to the institutions that govern the Bay Area. And it's not a history that belongs to them. It's a history that's at odds with them and has always been at odds with them. It's a history that belongs to the people of the Bay Area. Yeah. And so that's our direction. We have stuff in the works, projects coming. Stay tuned.
Do you have plans for like podcasts or anything along those lines?
It's all secret.
Okay, just let us know and we'll help promote it once it happens.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'd be happy to do that. I'm gonna wrap, but folks, you've been listening to Mat Wranovix with Left in the Bay, talking about People's Park, the history of People's Park, the history of radical politics in the Bay Area. To be honest, it was a great episode. If you like what you're hearing, please check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you're watching this on YouTube, hit that subscribe button. If you're listening to us on audio, one of the audio platforms, give us a rate and review. It helps with the algorithms. And if you really like what we're doing, check us out at patreon.com/greenredpodcast, or go to our website, greenredpodcast.org, and hit that support button. And everybody, Matt, thanks for joining us. This was great. Everyone else out there, go out and make a lot of trouble and misbehave. We'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Yep.
People's Park. Yeah. People's Park. People's Park. Yeah, People's Park. People's Park. People's Park. People's Park. People's Park.
I'm in the streets like Ninja Cat. People's Park in Berkeley, California. Let's bring it back, a whole new era, erasing history. And I don't know what's scarier, but shit, the more the merrier. Gentrification shit, things change up. We got behind and they blame us. Flip the coin, now I came up. Now I want more, maybe a corner store. I never had it before. Am I the problem? Can we get more? I gotta make my voice become a sword. They cut down the trees, our elders is gone. First trophy, this is People's Park. Shout out Christina, you know that I mean it. If you're from Berkeley, I know your soul is bleeding.
People's Park. People's Park. People's Park. People's Park. People's Park. People's Park. People's Park.
Hey,
People's Park.